So I think the topic of platforming is pretty interesting. Like, what's your view on platforming controversial people? Let's start with the old. Would you interview Hitler on your podcast, and how would you talk to him? Oh, and follow-up question:
Mm.
Would you interview him in 1935, 41, and then like 45?
Well, I think we have an uncanny valley problem with respect to this issue of whether or not to speak to bad people, right? So if a person's sufficiently bad, right, if they're all the way out of the valley, then you can talk to them, and it's totally unproblematic to talk to them because you don't have to spend any time signaling to your audience that you don't agree with them. And if you're interviewing Hitler, you don't have to say, "Listen, I just got to say before we start, I don't agree with the whole genocide thing, and I just think you're killing mental patients in vans and all that. That was all bad. It's a bad look, Adolf. So you just it can go without saying that you don't agree with this person, and you're not platforming them to signal boost their views. You're just trying to, if they're sufficiently evil, you can go into it very much as an anthropologist would. You just want to understand the nature of evil, right? You just want to understand this phenomenon. Like, how is this person who they are, right? And that strikes me as a intellectually interesting and morally necessary thing to do, right? So yes, I think you always interview Hitler.
Wait.
Well, once he's Hitler,
But when do you know it?
once he's legitimately
But
Hitler.
when do you know it? Is genocide really happening?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
1942, 43?
No. If you're on the cusp of it, where it's just he's someone who's gaining power, and you don't want to help facilitate that, then there's a question of whether you can undermine him while pushing back against him in that interview, right? So there are people I wouldn't talk to just because I don't want to give them oxygen, and I don't think that in the context of my interviewing them, I'm going to be able to take the wind out of their sails at all, right? So it's like, for whatever, either because it's an asymmetric advantage, because I just know that they can do something that they within the span of an hour that I can't correct for.
Sure.
It's like they can light many small fires, and it just takes too much time to put them out.
That's more like on the topic of vaccines, for example, having a debate on the efficacy of vaccines.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not that I don't think sunlight is usually the best disinfectant. I think it is. Even these asymmetries aside, I mean, it is true that a person can always make a mess faster than you can clean it up, right? But still, there are debates worth having, even given that limitation. And they're the right people to have those specific debates. And there's certain topics where, I'll debate someone just because I'm the right person for the job, and it doesn't matter how messy they're going to be. It's just worth it because I can make my points land, at least to the right part of the audience.
So some of it is just your own skill and competence, and also interest in preparing correctly.
Well, yeah, and the nature of the subject matter, but there are other people who just by default I would say, well, there's no reason to give this guy a platform. And there are also people who are so confabulatory that they're making such a mess with every sentence that insofar as you're even trying to interact with what they're saying, you're by definition going to fail, and you're going to seem to fail to a sufficiently large uninformed audience, where it's going to be a net negative for the cause of truth, no matter how good you are. So, like, for instance, I think talking to Alex Jones on any topic for any reason is probably a bad idea, because I just think he's just neurologically wired to just utter a string of sentences. He'll get 20 sentences out, each of which is contains more lies than the last, and there's not time enough in the world to run down, and certainly not time enough in the span of a conversation to run down each of those leads to bedrock so as to falsify it. I mean, he'll just make shit up. Or make shit up and then weave it in with half truths and micro truths that give some semblance of credibility to somebody out there. I mean, apparently millions of people out there. And there's just no way to untangle that in real time with him.
I have noticed that you have an allergic reaction to confabularization,
Yeah, confabulation. Yeah, yeah,
confabulation.
yeah.
That if somebody says something a little micro untruth, it really stops your brain.
Here, I'm not talking about micro untruths. I'm just talking about making up things out of whole cloth. Just like if someone says something, like, "Well, what about?" and then the thing they put at the end of that sentence is just a set of pseudo facts, right? That you can't possibly authenticate or not in the span of that conversation. They will, whether it's about UFOs or anything else, right? They will seem to make you look like an ignoramus when, in fact, everything they're saying is specious, right? Whether they know it or not. I mean, there's some people who are just crazy. There's some people who are just bullshitting and they're not even tracking whether it's true.
Yeah.
It just feels good. And there's some people who are consciously lying about things.
But don't you think that's just a kind of jazz masterpiece of untruth that you should be able to just wave off by saying, like, well, none of that is backed up by any evidence, and just almost like take it to the humor place,
Well, yeah,
and
but
then
but the thing is I mean, just the place I'm familiar with doing this and not doing this is on specific conspiracies like 9/11 truth, right? Like the 9/11. So because of what 9/11 did to my intellectual life, I mean, it really just it sent me down a path for the better part of a decade. Like I became a critic of religion when I don't know if I was ever going to be a critic of religion, right? Like, but it happened to be in my wheelhouse because I had spent so much time studying religion on my own, and I was also very interested in the underlying spiritual concerns of every religion, and so I was you know I devoted a full more than a full decade of my life to just what is real here, what is possible, what is the nature of subjective reality, and how does it relate to reality at large, and is there anything to who was someone like Jesus or Buddha, and are these people frauds, or are these just myths, or is there really a continuum of insight to be had here that is interesting? So I spent a lot of time on that question through the full decade of my 20s.
and that was launched in part by 9/11 truther
No, but
kind of
then when
conspiracy.
9/11 happened, I had spent all this time, reading religious books, empathically understanding the motivations of religious people, right? Knowing just how fully certain people believe what they say they believe, right? So I took religious convictions very seriously. And then people started flying planes into our buildings, and I knew that there was something to be said about
Allegedly.
the core doctrines of Islam. Yeah, exactly. So I went down. So that became my wheelhouse for a time. Um, you know, terrorism and jihadism and related topics. And so the 9/11 truth conspiracy thing kept getting aimed at me. And the question was, well, do I want to debate these
Mm.
people, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Alex Jones, perhaps.
yeah, I mean, yeah. So Alex Jones, I think, was an early purveyor of it, although I don't think I knew who he was at that point. Um, and privately, I had some very long debates with people who, one person in my family went way down that rabbit hole, and I just, every 6 months or so, I'd literally write the 2-hour email, that would try to deprogram him, however ineffectually, and uh, so I went back and forth for years on that topic with in private with people, but I could see the structure of the conspiracy. I could see the nature of how impossible it was to play whack-a-mole sufficiently well so as to convince anyone of anything who was not seeing the problematic structure of that way of thinking. I mean, it's not actually a thesis. It's a proliferation of anomalies that you can't actually connect all the dots that are being pointed to. They don't connect in a coherent way. They're incompatible theses that are not, and their incompatibility is not being acknowledged. But they're they're running this algorithm of things are never what they seem. There's always malicious conspirators doing things perfectly. That we see evidence of human incompetence everywhere else.
Hmm.
No one can tie their shoes, expertly anywhere else, but over here, people are perfectly competent. They're perfectly concealing things. Like thousands of people are collaborating, you know, inexplicably. I mean, incentivized by what? Who knows? They're collaborating to murder thousands of their neighbors, and no one is breathing a peep about it. No one's getting caught on camera. No one's breathed a word of it to a journalist. Um, and so I've dealt with that style of thinking, and I know what it's like to be in the weeds of a conversation like that,
Hmm.
the person will say, "Okay, well, but what do you make of the fact that all those F-16s were flown 800 miles out to sea on the morning of 9/11 doing an exercise that hadn't even been scheduled for that day, but it was." And now all of these are. I dimly recall some thesis of that kind, but I'm just making these things up now, right?
Hmm.
So, like that detail hadn't even been scheduled for that day; it's just inexplicably run that day. Like, so what? How long would it take to track that down? Right, the
Yeah.
idea that this is anomalous, like that there was a F-16 exercise run and it wasn't even supposed to be run that day, right?
Yeah.
Someone like Alex Jones, their speech pattern is to pack as much of that stuff in as possible at the highest velocity that a person can speak. And unless you're knocking down each one of those things to that audience, you appear to just be uninformed. You appear to
Yeah.
just not be, you don't, wait, he didn't know about the F 16s.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
he doesn't know about Project Mockingbird. You haven't heard about Project Mockingbird? I just made up Project Mockingbird. I don't know what it is, but that's the kind of thing that comes at tumbling out in a conversation like that. And that's the kind of thing, frankly, I was worried about in the COVID conversation, because not that someone like Brett would do it consciously, but someone like Brett is swimming in a sea of misinformation on social, living on Twitter, getting people sending the blog post and the study from the Philippines that showed that in this cohort ivermectin did X, right? And not like to actually run anything to ground, right? You have to actually do the work journalistically and scientifically and run it to ground, right? So for some of these questions, you actually have to be a statistician to say, okay, they used the wrong statistics in this experiment,
Hmm.
right? Now, yes, we could take all the time to do that, or we could at every stage along the way in a context where we have experts we can trust, go with with what 97% of the experts are saying about X,
Yeah.
about the safety of mRNA, about the transmissibility of COVID, about whether to wear masks or not wear masks. And I completely agree that that broke down uh, unacceptably over the last few years, and but I think that's largely social media and blogs and the efforts of podcasters and Substack writers were not just a response to that. I think it was a symptom of that and a cause of that, right? And I think we're living in an environment where people we have trained ourselves not to be able to agree about facts on any topic, no matter how urgent, right? What's flying in our sky? What's happening in Ukraine? Is Putin just denazifying Ukraine? I mean, like, there are people who we respect who are spending time down that particular rabbit hole. Like, this is maybe there are a lot of Nazis in Ukraine, and that's the real problem, right? Maybe Putin's not the bad actor here, right? How much time do I have to spend empathizing with Putin to the point of thinking, well, maybe Putin's got a point, and it's like, well, what about the polonium and the nerve agents and the killing of journalists and the Navalny and, like, does that count? Well, no. listen, I'm not paying so much attention to that because I'm following all these interesting people on Twitter, and they're giving me some pro-Putin material here. And there are some Nazis in Ukraine. It's not like there are no Nazis in Ukraine. How am I going to weight these things? I think people are being driven crazy by Twitter.
Yeah. But you're kind of speaking to conspiracy theories that pollute everything, and then but every example you gave is kind of a bad faith style of conversation,
But it's not necessarily knowingly bad faith by, I mean, the
unintentionally.
people
Yeah.
who are worried about Ukrainian Nazis, to my, I mean, they're some of the same people. They're the same people who are worried about ivermectin got suppressed. Like ivermectin is really a panacea, but it got suppressed because no one could make billions on it. Um, it's the same. It's literally this. It's in many cases the same people and the same efforts to unearth those
And you're
facts.
saying it's very difficult to have conversations with those kinds of people. What about conversation with Trump himself? Would you do a podcast with Trump?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I'd be learning anything about him. It's like with Hitler, and I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler, but
Clips guy,
yeah,
here's
yeah,
your chance.
yeah.
You got this one.
With certain world historical figures, I would just feel like, okay, this is an opportunity to learn something that I'm not going to learn. I think Trump is among the most superficial people we have ever laid eyes on. Right? Like he is in public view, right? And I'm sure there's some distance between who he is in private and who he is in public, but it's not going to be the kind of distance that's going to blow my mind. And I think so. I think the liability of for instance, I think Joe Rogan was very wise not to have Trump on his podcast. I think all he would have been doing is he would have put himself in a situation where he couldn't adequately contain the damage Trump was doing, and he was just going to make Trump seem cool to a whole new, or potentially new cohort of his massive audience, right? I mean, they would have had a lot of laughs. Trump's funny. I mean, the entertainment value of things is so influential. I mean, there was that one debate where Trump, got a massive laugh on his line, only Rosie O'Donnell, right? The truth is, we're living in a political system where if you can get a big laugh during a political debate, you win. It doesn't matter who you are. Like that's the level of it doesn't matter how uninformed you are. It doesn't matter that half the debate was about what the hell we should do about a threat of nuclear war or anything else. It's we're monkeys, right? And we like to laugh.